Hi, I'm Brian Valentino, and as a popular request from many of my friends, and including my favorite friend, my wife, we're going to do another video today explaining some of what's happened during our presidential election. And I'm joined today by one of my very best friends in the whole wide world, Mr. Mike Peter.
Hi, thank you for having me, and I too count your wife as one of my best friends. So we'll do this in her name.
This is for you, Marie. So for those of you who may want to skip ahead to the things you're interested in, today we're going to be talking about how electors are selected and some additional talk about where they come from and how they become members of the college. We're also going to talk about where the right to protest comes from. This question comes to us from my cousin Adam Greco down in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which is where Mike's from. We're also going to take a question from Michael Solano from New Jersey, who wants to know what happens if the president or vice president died before the inauguration. And a question that many of you asked, how did all of the polls get it wrong? And we're going to talk a little bit about why polls aren't a science and why they're just a tool that we use. So, Mike, why don't you start talking a little bit about the Electoral College? We already talked in our last session, which you were not part of. We talked about the Electoral College system and how it works, but how are the actual people who serve on the Electoral College selected?
Well, thank you, Brian.
Welcome, Mike.
The Electoral College is not really as much of a mystery as people think it is. As Brian talked about in his last session, he talked a lot about the reasons why we have this filtering process. But essentially, when we talk about the electors and who they are, they're really chosen through the party system. So when you have your conventions held, now in modern days in the summer, before we actually nominate the candidate, you have different people who are vying for the nomination generally. So, for instance, at the Democratic convention, you had Bernie Sanders with a large number of votes, and you had Hillary Clinton with a large number of votes. And there was a lot of wrangling during the convention on what would happen to those votes. So essentially, when we nominate somebody at the party convention, we're actually also electing those people who are going to be electors for that individual candidate. And they go through generally their party process at the local level, and they rise up through the ranks to say, if I, in my precinct, in my section of Virginia or New Jersey, I will represent my chosen candidate in this election. It was, of course, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. So what happens next is once they've been selected, those people, again, they're generally party loyalists. They may be elected officials. There'll be a nice mixture of people.
All right, so let me stop you there.
Yeah,
So for the people who are wondering, in New Jersey, I got a lot of questions out of this. In New Jersey, almost all of the people that are electors for Hillary Clinton are actually officers at the state Democratic Party. And that's obviously not their full-time job. They're union officials and lawyers in different professions, just like anybody running for any other office. It just so happens that they are electors who are also party officers for the state. One thing I found interesting in New York State, I wanted to go see who were Hillary's electors in New York State, and the very first name on the list is William Jefferson Clinton. So her own husband would serve as an elector when the Electoral College from New York meets. Hillary having won New York State, her husband will be one of the people casting a ballot, presumably in her name. And also Mayor Bill de Blasio is one of the electors from New York. So it's, like Mike said, they are party loyalists.
Yeah, and it may be different states. Brian and I went to college with someone who's very active in Republican Party politics in Stanton, Virginia.
We can call her name. She's going to watch.
Yes, Ann Tache Fitzgerald.
Hi,
Hi, Ann. And as I understand it, Ann is a Donald Trump elector and will be going to the Electoral College to cast an official electoral vote for Donald Trump. Now, the Electoral College meets, and it's actually prescribed by law, the Electoral College meets on the Monday after the second Wednesday in December. And of course, that timing, again, just like Election Day, has to do with the history of the Electoral College and when people could get away from their farming and make the long trip to officially cast that ballot.
Which, given where Ann lives, may actually be the case for her.
I believe so.
Hopefully you got the crop in, Ann.
We hope for the best. So I believe the Electoral College every 4 years, I believe where they actually meet, it rotates around the country, and I think this year it's in Atlanta.
Nope, they meet in their state capitals on Electoral College Day.
Okay, there was something to do with Atlanta that I can't remember, but we'll talk about that later.
Let's find out who remembers correctly, shall we?
Yes, that's number one for your quiz today. So they'll cast that vote, and then the official tally of the Electoral College goes to the House of Representatives in January after the new House is seated.
That's right.
Thank you. And they'll officially read out, and they will convene, read out the results of the Electoral College, and then they will ratify that vote. Now
they meet in joint session, the House and the Senate, which means that the President of the Senate is the higher house, the upper house. The President of the Senate will be the one who opens and reads the results. And traditionally, the Vice President, in his formal role as President of the Senate, will be the one who actually reads that vote.
Now, there's also a lot of talk out there with different petitions and things that are going around. I think I heard there were 4 million people who were signing some sort of a petition recently trying to get electors in the Electoral College to change their vote. And that's not something you're really going to see happen. In history, we've seen it a handful of times. The 2000 election, there was a rogue elector who cast a vote actually for Al Gore when it wasn't who actually took I think D.C. at the time it was, but previous to that, it's only been every once in a while that you see this happen. There are, I think it's only 21 out of the 50 states that actually have faithless electoral laws, which
26.
It prohibits the electors from changing their vote, but generally at the same time the consequence of that is anywhere from a fine to maybe a misdemeanor. It's not necessarily somebody going to get thrown into jail, but what we see over time is that people take this very specifically. They run as an elector for a specific individual, and let's look at the political landscape right now. Even if you were able to get 20 or 30 electors to change their votes in the upcoming meeting of the Electoral College, those results will be read out. They will be ratified by a Republican House and a Republican Senate. So even if it got that far, it's not going to happen. We've had an election, and it rests with the Electoral College.
So my cousin Maria, who lives in the great state of Delaware, asked that question, and I think it's important to note that it's not like this is something that's a new conversation. Every single presidential election, there is talk about reforming the Electoral College system. There was actually a move a few years ago that the states were actually passing around a petition amongst the states that said that if a popular vote were to go different than the Electoral College, that the electors from that state would have to cast their ballots for the winner of the popular vote. And the big predicate there was that all the states had to agree to it before it would go into effect. So obviously it's not going anywhere.
Now the interesting thing, I think, when you look at different options as far as when people are talking about reforming the Electoral College, you look at Maine and Nebraska, who have essentially a proportional system to award their electors. And that's something that's been talked about quite a bit, especially when you see how close the races were in what became some of the battleground states like Pennsylvania and Michigan. There's also always a lot of talk. Well, heck, you look at California, it's always called for whoever the Democratic presidential candidate is about 28 seconds after the polls close. Right. And those are 55 electoral votes. That's a big number when you're trying to get to 270. So this conversation will be ongoing, but we also have to think into recent history. You look at the year 2000. The presidential election was essentially decided by a few thousand votes in the state of Florida. And we all remember the hanging chads and all the recounts in Florida at the time. And you think about that writ large. Those types of things happen throughout the country. We have no uniform election technology. We have 800 different ways that things are actually counted, from paper ballots that are scanned to drawing lines from one side of a piece of paper to another to the touch screens. And that presents, when you talk about, in this case, more than 100 million people who were voting, that presents a big problem if you're trying to calculate just the popular vote here. So I think that the fix is somewhere eventually in between, but we're never going to get rid of the Electoral College. But maybe Maine and Nebraska, what do they say? As Maine goes, so goes the nation. So maybe,
Ohio,
well, yeah, just about everywhere. But I think, certainly this is a hot conversation. We'll probably lose this thread in 3 months, but maybe there'll be some move in the future to at least look at a proportional system.
The good news is that we only have to wait 4 years to have this exact same debate again.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and bookmark this, and you can come back to it.
We'll see you in 2020.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to note that the swing states, while recently we've looked to Florida and Ohio and Pennsylvania, those are recent swing states. Swing states change historically. And the big states with a lot of electoral votes also tend to change. Now, you figure California was a Republican stronghold up until and through the Reagan administration, and Texas was a Democratic stronghold up until the ideologies of the South and the Dixiecrat areas swapped to go from being post-Civil War Democrats to, I guess, post-Reconstruction Republicans.
Yeah, the 1970s and 1980s were a big time of transition for both parties.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think we've about beaten the electors to death. Why don't we move on?
But we're not beating you to death, Ann. No. So yeah, don't worry.
Ann, we're proud of you. Yeah. You've done your alma mater, and Mike and I are very proud.
Yes.
And I hope that when you're casting your ballot for Donald Trump, in your head you're saying, I'm doing this for Mike and Brian, because then this will all have been worth it.
Yeah.
So let's move on. Somebody had asked the question about the right to protest, my cousin Adam, and he wanted to know why, and I'm going to paraphrase Adam, but he wanted to know what gave Americans the right to protest an election. And I think the answer is actually pretty easy to understand, and that's just that, in the First Amendment, we have the right to peaceably assemble. And over the years, the Supreme Court has put restrictions on that right to assemble. It's not an absolute right, Mike. Isn't that right?
Yeah,
Mike?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So you can, local jurisdictions can require you to get a permit. They can require you to divulge who the leaders of the protest are and what their contact information is.
I was just listening to the radio the other day, and there in New York City, in a certain area, there were hordes of Trump protesters and hordes of Clinton protesters. They put them into two equal-sized pens, basically, and said, you can't go outside of this square or you're arrested.
And even if I think the most ironic example of this is at the presidential conventions,
Yes.
when they actually have protest areas pre-established that are blocks away from the convention sites. But that's done, one, to protect the public's right to protest. It's also done to protect the protesters from the public, and it's done to protect the public from the protesters. This is no different than if you want to have a parade in your hometown. You have to go get a permit that says you're going to assemble on a public right-of-way, and that there's a potential that you're going to deny the public from use of publicly owned property while you're doing it.
But, on the flip side of that, we saw recent protests in Portland. I saw a protest today in Washington, D.C. These were illegal protests because they blocked traffic. They blocked all safe means of any way of being able to go about your business in the city, and they were forcibly broken up because of that. Not because people were protesting, but because they were doing it outside the bounds of what's legally allowed in those cities.
That's considered and classified as an unconstitutional First Amendment violation. You cannot non-peaceably protest. And so, yes, those people can be broken up. We don't like that as Americans because historically we like people standing up and exercising their right to free speech, and we like people standing up and exercising their right to free and peaceful assembly. But when those protesters forget the word peaceably, we tend to get into trouble. So for those of you considering a protest out there, do it peaceably and make sure you have a permit.
Yes.
And the funny thing is that especially in big cities, the police departments are used to this. They know what the routine is. They realize that an organized group that's coming in and wants to just have their voices heard If they come to the police and say, we want to do this and we have a right, the police are not there to tell you no. They're there to say yes, and here's how we're going to do it. Now, having been a city manager, I will tell you that very often the politicians may feel differently about that. But the police department's there to make sure everybody's safe and to make sure everybody's rights are protected.
Yeah.
And, just like with all of the problems that we've been having with race relations this year, and they are truly problems and the country has to grapple with them yet, by and large, and not exclusively, but by and large, if people are following the rules, if people are exercising their constitutional rights in an appropriate way, the police department would rather be spending time on other things. But again, there's always some bad apples in the bunch, and I'm sure the rest of the law enforcement community is just not as proud of those members of their unions as everybody else might want them to be.
Yeah.
So, Adam, First Amendment, and gives you the right to protest. And I think it's also important to note that the 14th Amendment, which makes all the laws equally applicable to everybody, extended that First Amendment right to the states. So the federal government has a right to peaceable assembly, and all 50 states are also required to recognize that right. Next question, again, comes from Mike Solano in New Jersey, and his question was, and I want to see if you look at this differently than I do.
Okay.
Mike's question is, what happens if the president-elect dies or resigns before the inauguration? And I'll expand that because I've given this some thought, so I get to cheat a little bit. What happens if he dies or resigns before the Electoral College
And of course,
votes?
we've not seen that. We've seen a president die within a month of taking office because he spoke too long at his own inauguration and contracted pneumonia, but we've not seen this.
So Donald, short speech, make it memorable. But what happens if President-elect Trump dies before the Electoral College meets, and what happens if he dies before Inauguration Day?
I would assume that the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 would in some way be applied, because we have an official tally of the popular votes. Those popular votes are translating into electoral votes, as we just talked about. Certainly we would still probably, I would think, go through the electoral vote. Everything would be certified. The president, even if he had passed away at that point.
Well, we're talking about the president-elect.
But when you get to the Electoral College, that person would still be voted, and the vice president, would become the vice president. But I would suppose then, immediately upon that vote being ratified, then the vice president would then take the oath of office, or not take the oath of office, but would then be essentially the president in waiting.
So I think part of this is we've never had to deal with it before, so we don't know for sure. Here's my read of it. I don't believe that the Presidential Succession Act comes into play at all. The way I look at it is that the Electoral College can only vote on the names that were in front of them.
Yep.
So presumably the electors that were won by Secretary Clinton are going to go in and they're going to cast one ballot for Hillary Clinton for president, one ballot for Governor Kane for vice president, because in the Electoral College they get to cast two votes. And those electors for Donald Trump are going to come in and vote for Donald Trump or Mike Pence for vice president. Assuming in Mike's scenario that Donald Trump dies before the Electoral College, I don't see how it changes. I think that the electors will vote for Donald Trump for president in the Electoral College, and they will vote for Mike Pence for vice president. The 25th Amendment to the Constitution says that in the event of the president's death or incapacity, the vice president becomes president. He doesn't become acting president, he becomes president. So my guess is that regardless of whether it happens before or after the Electoral College, should Vice President-elect Trump die at the inauguration, Vice President-elect Pence would be sworn in as president, because it'd be the first opportunity for him to be sworn in as something. There would be a vacancy in the presidency at that point, and he would be sworn in as president. Interestingly enough, he would then be free to appoint his own vice president with the advice and consent of both the Senate and the House. It's one of the, or I should say, it's the only advice and consent
From both.
motion that both houses have to act on. So then presumably the Republican Senate and the Republican House would scramble to find out which one of them was most qualified to be vice president and who had to get shoved out of Congress to make room for a more desirable person, and that person would become vice president.
Yeah.
That's my guess. So for what that's worth, Mike, we don't know. Let's hope it doesn't happen. We've had enough chaos this election cycle without having to deal with that. Okay, our next topic has to do with polls. And I think Mike Solano actually gave me this one too. Why? Or maybe it was Ed Horn. I can't remember. Let's give it to Eddie Horn because
Mike Solano's he's not an overachiever, is he?
So, well, Eddie is. So Eddie Horn from Ocean Township, New Jersey. This one's for you. How did they all get it wrong?
We're talking about the pollsters?
Well, let's go with pollsters. It'll keep us out of trouble. So, Mike, what do you think?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and one of the things that I've enjoyed once we sort of got through the hangover of the election is really looking at all the Monday morning quarterbacking. What went wrong, what did we know, what didn't we know, who did what, when, where, and why. But I think it comes down to a few issues, and I know you'll talk about your area of specialty, margin of error, a couple of those issues. I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind, polls haven't gotten it right consistently in the last couple of elections. And you need to look at two different things. You and I have talked a lot about Real Clear Politics and looking at the average of all of the state polls, which is a better way to look at it instead of just your random assignment of 1,913 voters to look at the Washington Post daily tracking poll. That doesn't mean anything in a presidential election. What means something is who's likely to come out to vote and how is it going to affect the Electoral College vote in each of the states. And I think one of the things that we've seen quite a bit of is, first of all, when Trump was running in the Republican primary, all the modeling said there was no way that he could win. But all that modeling was based on some very specific assumptions about candidates following the rules, so to speak, or fitting a mold, and having a certain type of an operation, which he didn't. There wasn't the door-to-door knocking. There wasn't, there were the big crowds. There was a ground operation, but it was a different kind of a ground operation. So they got wrong all the way through the primaries. Then you flash forward to the general election, and a lot of the pollsters out there kept saying that we are 99% certain, within a margin of error of plus or minus 3%, that likely voters will do the following. But we need to ask the question, what is that likely voter? What is that model? And that's changed now in this election. It's not, now I'm not saying this was the likely voter, but it's not, 37-year-old males who are left-handed and drive Nissans on a daily basis.
We know you're out there.
Yeah, you're there somewhere. But it's much more than that. There were entire groups of people who came out in the last set of elections, couple of elections, who didn't necessarily come out this time. There were people who did come out this time who didn't come out in the past, and it begs sort of another look at how pollsters try to put together something to say this is a likely voter, this is who is going to come out, and then let's take our random sampling from there.
I think it's important that we also talk a little bit about what a poll is.
Yeah.
So I'm sure most of you have heard the line, there's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics. All a poll is a statistical formula that, using a small subset of a population, can forecast what the entirety of that population would say or do or act or think in a given situation. And in some statistical analyses, when you can take a lot of variables out, we can get that down to a pretty low margin of error. The margin of error is the, and I'm not a mathematician, and I didn't do well in statistics, but the margin of error is the wiggle room that the poll has in between what is fact and what the poll is estimating, based upon the fact that they can't take out all the variables. And I'm sure there are statisticians watching this right now who are cringing in pain at that terrible, terrible definition.
But I think if you look at it, I think that's a good way to explain it. If you look at it with what we always saw on the television, ABC News would say that it's a close race. It's 52-48%. And they're saying that's a statistical tie because the margin of error is plus or minus 3%. That means the 52 is actually anywhere between 49 and 55. So it ends up being 6. I did. It took me a minute there. But if you look at it the other way, if it's 48-52, then you have a lot of overlap there because that 48 can go up to 51 and down to 45. So it really is potentially a statistical dead heat there because you have essentially, if it's plus or minus 3%, you have a 6-point swing on either side.
Right. So what a poll's going to do is a poll's going to look at, let's say, 600 people. Out of a population of 10,000. And statisticians are going to tell you that when you look at a subset of 600 of 10,000, you're going to get a margin of error that's, let's say, 5%. And depending on what you're using it for, 5% might be great. And depending on what the results are, it might not matter because 5%, when it comes back as 75-25, well, 5% is not going to change anything. But this is where I have to argue that I don't think that the polls got it completely wrong. First thing we have to look at is what were they polling? And Mike and I were discussing this earlier. We completely agree. If you look at what was being polled, these were nationwide polls, especially at the very end. They were looking for the popular vote because it's the easiest poll to take. And almost all of those polls, in fact, I only found 2. This doesn't apply to, but all of the polls except for that 2 had Hillary Clinton winning within the margin of error over Donald Trump. And then when you look at the actual results of that poll, Hillary Clinton did in fact win the popular vote within that margin of error.
Yeah, isn't the margin she won by 200,000 or 300,000 votes out of 100 million?
It's a tiny little percentage.
Yeah.
But remember, if you're measuring nationwide, who's going to win the election, and the poll comes back and says Hillary Clinton is winning, guess what? The poll accurately predicted the popular vote.
Well, and keep in mind, earlier when I was saying about talking about the Washington Post poll, that's a nationwide daily tracking poll of about 1,913 likely voters. And yeah, I think it did track along that way. I will also say, as when we talk, I've never been called for a poll. Have you?
I get called all the time.
For a national poll?
Well, I answer them and I like talking to them.
Oh, yeah. So you're that guy?
I'm that guy.
You're that guy. Okay.
I believe in polls.
I curse at people when they call me. So.
Well, it's my cherub-like demeanor.
True.
They like talking to me.
They do.
So what Mike and I have discussed is that we then had to go back and look at what the state-by-state polls were. And even then, when we go and look at the state-by-state polls, the majority of them correctly predicted the state-level vote within the margin of error. So they don't do a lot of state-specific polling very late in the game because it's not worth the effort. They do a lot more of it during the primary seasons. But the one that I saw, I think, was Wisconsin, and Wisconsin had Trump winning by 2 points with a margin of error of 3.5%. Okay, guess what? Correctly predicted the election outcome.
Yeah.
I think where we're getting into, and to the question that Mike or Eddie asked, was the hype that was coming. Even if you look at Saturday Night Live, can we call her President Clinton yet? I think we can. Everybody was saying Hillary was going to win. And when you look at the number of states that she lost within thousands of votes, not even tens of thousands, but very achievable numbers. 1 or 2 states could have absolutely swung it to her. But to the Trump campaign's credit, they were accurately reading the states that they thought they had a lead in, and they knew that you only have to win by 1 vote. So if you're within striking distance, go make that extra push.
Hence why Trump spent time in Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Michigan, all of these places that the general consensus, at least the sort of outward public consensus was, why are you doing that? It doesn't make
Right.
any sense. He, though, was addressing crowds of tens of thousands of people. And
Right.
now we see, a little bit more of the strategy behind what they were doing, especially at the end. That and taking away his Twitter account, of course.
Right. And well, and let's do a little editorializing while we're here. You and I haven't discussed this, so this is the first I'm hearing it, and this may be terrible, terrible internet viewing, but what impact, if any, do you think that FBI Director Comey's actions 10 days out and 3 days out did, if anything?
Well, it's interesting. I think that it had a degree of impact on the so-called millennial voters out there who did not come out in the same numbers, same percentages for Hillary Clinton as they did for Donald Trump. I think you have people who have been raised in a 24-hour news cycle where you get your news. It's a quick bit on the internet, a CNN flash, with all the pretty graphics and all that, and the camera that never stops moving. So you get your news there, and I think it did have an effect, not a massive effect, but when you see, 4 million votes going to Gary Johnson, and you see a couple of million votes going to Jill Stein, and a lot of those votes are the millennial votes, I think it had the effect of pushing a good number of those voters away from her as some sort of a protest vote, because they heard that, so there has to be something behind it, but I don't have time to really think about it or really see what it is that they're talking about. I think it confirmed some people's suspicions, even though everything came out in the clear just before the election, but I think it did have an effect specifically on the millennial voters.
Interesting. I think the FBI did a great job.
And J. Edgar Hoover is spinning in his grave right now.
Well, I don't know who's watching this, but if anybody the FBI is watching, you guys did a great job.
Rock and roll.
Rock and roll. What do you think the Trump administration is going to do about pursuing Hillary and throwing her in jail?
I don't think they'll do anything about
so.
it. I think it was campaign rhetoric, and part of the harsh force of we're mad and this is how we're going to voice that. I was really disappointed on both sides in this campaign because we never had the opportunity to have an exchange of ideas. It was you're bad, no you're bad, no you're worse, you're worse. I have to think back to, again, the 2000 election where we had what you and I loved, but I think the rest of the country didn't. We had a fantastic debate between the two vice presidential candidates where there was a respectful discussion of ideas where they disagreed, but there was no name calling.
The good old days.
Exactly, and we didn't have that. So I think this is just another vestige. Now that Trump is moving into transition, it would be more than political suicide for that to be something that he pursued. Half the country that voted for Hillary Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't come out of the gate, and you really just can't come out and alienate half the country that felt so deeply for their candidate.
Do you think that President Obama gives her a pardon anyway?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, because I think that raises it to the level of a forever stain on whatever legacy she's going to have. What do you think?
I think that in one of those little quiet conversations in the Oval Office that none of us are party to, that's discussed and agreed to as to what's going to happen.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
And Director Comey, you were there, weren't you?
Good job. Okay, so I think we've bored everybody watching to death. If you made it this far, congratulations. Some of the topics we're going to be discussing, well, not we, I will be discussing, because you are going to go back to the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I will return to the County of Monmouth.
But remember, in February, we will be rejoining you for our annual, very important Academy Awards watch party. This year, I believe it's brought to you by Maker's Mark Whiskey.
Well, many good things have been brought to us by Maker's Mark Whiskey. So topics that I will be discussing in the future, other than the Academy Awards, include a full description and explanation of what's happening at the inauguration. A lot of people want to know what the president's military powers are and how he exercises them, so we'll be talking about that. I want to talk about how the first families move in and out of the White House, because
Fascinating.
it's a really incredible little story how that works. And I also got a special request from my kids. They want to know how Christmas works at the White House. So we'll talk about Christmas decorations and how Santa gets into the White House without his sleigh being shot off the roof with a
Well, and which of the
surfaced air
40
vessel.
plus chimneys do they go down? Does he go down?
It's a fair question. It deserves a fair answer.
You know, and I hope when you talk about moving in, I think it's an interesting complication. Usually on Inauguration Day, the outgoing president boards his helicopter and just flies off into the sunset somewhere. I'm sure Obama will do the same thing, but they're not going to drop him off the 2 miles from the White House where he'll be living. I just find this very interesting. And, you know, where is he going to pop up? And, you know, what effect is that going to have? You know, is he going to crash all the parties and kind of be Where's Waldo in the background? I don't know. I think
don't know.
he has a sense of humor.
The
So
plan was he was going to get appointed to the Supreme Court, and
And
now that's gone.
probably not going to happen.
Probably
not.
Barack, if you're waiting for that call,
We're sorry.
just go watch the Wizards, man. It's not going to
Yeah.
happen.
Work on DC statehood or something.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
My graduate school thesis.
See,
on
there you
that.
go. There you go.
All right, so live from the great city of Atlantic in Atlantic County, New Jersey, I'm Brian Valentino. This is my best friend, Mike Peter, and thank you for watching all the way to the end. Mom, we appreciate it.
Love you all.
Bye.
Bye.